Hey, this is Jay Clemens, and you're listening to Everything Fab Four on salon.com.
Welcome to Everything Fab Four, a podcast focused on fun and intelligent stories about the Beatles. I'm your host, Ken Womack, music culture columnist for salon.com and a Beatles scholar and historian. No other band, or popular phenomenon for that matter, has enjoyed the global impact the Beatles have and continue to have more than 50 years later. They are part of our human fabric. They created music that continues to bring people together, and just about everyone has their own Beatles story to tell, some that are surprisingly deep and unexpected. This show seeks to draw those stories out in interesting and insightful ways. Remember, it's a Beatles world, and everyone has a story.
The Pretty Nurse is so fascinating to me that, she's the only character in the song where Paul is wondering about their thoughts, their interior life. Imagining how she thinks about this scene, what it's like from her point of view. It's a very McCartney-esque songwriting move. He's a songwriter who just has that sort of telepathy crossed with empathy right away.
Today's guest is author and music journalist Rob Sheffield. Rob is a longtime writer and critic for Rolling Stone magazine, where he started in 1997. He published his first book, Love is a Mixtape, Life and Loss, One Song at a Time, in 2007. An autobiographical memoir, Love is a Mixtape traces the story of his first meeting with future wife, Renee Christ, their lives together, and Renee's sudden death from a pulmonary embolism after just 5 years of marriage. The book celebrates the abiding power of music, how it served as a backdrop for the couple's relationship, and the role that it played in helping the author to cope with her unfathomable loss. Rob is also the author of Dreaming the Beatles, the love story of one band and the whole world, winner of the 2017 Virgil Thomson Award for Outstanding Music Criticism. His other books include Talking to Girls About Duran Duran, One Young Man's Quest for True Love and a Cooler Haircut, Turn Around Bright Eyes, The Rituals of Love and Karaoke, On Bowie, and The Wild Heart of Stevie Nicks. Rob's most recent book is the 2024 New York Times bestseller, Heartbreak is the National Anthem, How Taylor Swift Reinvented Pop Music. Writing in the New York Times, Amanda Hess praises Rob's encyclopedic knowledge of Swift's music, fans, and business acumen, but especially her talent as a songwriter. Publishers Weekly lauded the unrestrained delight with which Sheffield captures his subject, mixing a fan's exuberance with a music critic's nuanced analysis. Rob was a special guest at the recent Everything Fab Four Fest in Asbury Park, celebrating the enduring majesty of Rubber Soul, which he often cites as his favorite Beatles album. Welcome, Rob Sheffield. Here we are celebrating Rubber Soul's 60th anniversary. Why do we keep coming back to this record? Should we be?
Amazing. We should absolutely be coming back to Rubber Soul. Rubber Soul goes with us everywhere. It's an album that continues to inspire and influence musicians to this day.
Well, and of course, we just had an entire conference about it, which thankfully we were very blessed and pleased to have you in attendance. Did you learn anything new about this album?
I learned so much new. It was really incredible. There were so many fantastic presentations, and I learned a ton. A lot of people were talking about Dylan and folk rock and that sort of influence on the Beatles. And something I learned from Tony Palia's excellent presentation on the folk influence on the Beatles, that Carolyn Hester, who was the folk singer with whom Bob Dylan recorded his first harmonica session work in the early 60s, that she did a cover of Buddy Holly's Tell Me How while Buddy Holly was still alive, and that this Buddy Holly Dylan link, which is incredibly direct. I had no idea it existed. It really blew my mind.
And that's the kind of thing, right, that we get with the Beatles is that, we've spent decades thinking about them, but we're really not there yet, are we? In terms of arriving at some point of fruition. There is no point of fruition.
Well, there's so many points of fruition is the thing. And Rubber Soul in particular, I mean, it inspired the Beatles for the rest of their career. If it obviously has a devoted cult of listeners, fans. Rubber Soul is my favorite. And I don't care if they made better albums, which they did. The White Album, I think, is even better, and Revolver. But to me, Rubber Soul is the one. And that's the one that the Beatles shocked themselves with how great it was. And they keep shocking me with it.
Well, and as you pointed out, when we were in Asbury Park, some days back, it still has this kind of hold over contemporary artists too, that it's inspiring them.
Yes. Ariana Grande, her last album, Eternal Sunshine, she said she was just so inspired by Rubber Soul and she wanted to make her version of Rubber Soul and not other Beatles albums. She was very specific about Rubber Soul being the influence on this one. And Phoebe Bridgers said that if she were a music teacher and she was playing pop music for a young kid who'd never heard pop music before, she said she'd play Rubber Soul because it's all in there.
And that's just beautiful to hear because, of course, if nothing else, the Beatles really, this is the wrong word, expose themselves as artists with that record, right? They really demonstrated that, this isn't a teeny bopper band. This isn't what you may have think we exported to the United States, 18 months earlier, or however long it was. This is something else altogether. We're artists, and artists create an artistic fusion. And in those two examples you just shared, that's literally happening. We see it happening with Billie Eilish and so many other folks who probably remain nameless, that once you set any kind of artistic fusion in motion, it's going to have these residual effects.
Well, in the Beatles, they showed themselves so willing to experiment and not repeat the formula. And in those early days for post-Chuck Berry rock and roll, that was something that was really shocking to people. I mean, it's funny to hear musicians from that era talk about the impact that Rubber Soul had on them. Of course, in most cases, meaning the American Rubber Soul that had I've Just Seen a Face on it. That's the one I grew up with too. But for Brian Wilson, who said, at the well-known story, but really moving story of how he heard Rubber Soul for the first time and was absolutely stunned. And the next morning, the song he wrote was God Only Knows. And that everything from Pet Sounds came directly from wanting to make an album as good as Revolver, as he said.
Well, and spawning a song like God Only Knows, which is a masterwork for the ages. I mean, if that's all you do.
Yes. And of course, Pet Sounds was a huge influence on the Beatles. Just as, the Rolling Stones heard Rubber Soul and the album they made was Aftermath. For Bob Dylan, the album he made was Blonde on Blonde. If you listen to those two albums back to back, Dylan's pre-Rubber Soul album and his post-Rubber Soul album, you listen to Highway 61, which is from the summer of 65, and then you listen to Blonde on Blonde from the summer of 66, and you can tell he's been cramming his head full of Rubber Soul in between. For one thing, he's writing songs with choruses and middle eights, bridges, all that kind of thing. He didn't do any of that before. There aren't any songs on Highway 61 that sound like that. There's two songs that have choruses, the first two, and then there's one song that has a bridge. But otherwise, Highway 61 it's one 4-line stanza after another. And you can hear on Blonde that he's been listening to Rubber Soul, and suddenly he's writing songs like I Want You and Just Like a Woman.
And what's beautiful about that is it reminds us, of course, that this was not some one directional influence where they were gaining from Dylan. It was more reflexive.
Absolutely.
Which is really cool. So I will unabashedly say that I love your work and I love the way you write about music because you're not afraid to write about it in a purely human fashion, right? I'll just say it. You're not afraid to gush, right? And and I mean that you know this. I mean that in the most loving way. You do not mind exposing that part of yourself and being vulnerable, and we see it. We see it in your regular columns, but also in Dreaming the Beatles and Heartbreak is the New National Anthem. You allow us to see why we love music. Where do you get that from? Where does that come from, do you think, in the DNA makeup of Rob Sheffield?
That's a very good question. Enthusiasm for me is to me, it's a source of whatever I have of wisdom comes from enthusiasm. And it's something that music has always brought out of me. You could blame it on Paul McCartney, honestly. Like Paul McCartney is one of the most genuinely enthusiastic humans that has ever existed, which of course makes some people feel horrified by the things he chooses to be enthusiastic about. But you see Paul McCartney in 2025 and how much he absolutely loves being on stage, how much he hates leaving. He hates having to leave for the encore break. He runs back. He is someone who runs from instrument to instrument, sitting at the piano, and then he runs to the bass, and then he runs to the guitar. He is always excited about the next song. And to me, that is just really kind of shocking. And I mean, from Paul, it's what we expect. But you look at Paul and Ringo, who's also still a phenomenal live performer in 2025, and you have to think like that sort of pure, undimmed, unjaded enthusiasm is what keeps them so young and nimble.
Right.
In a spiritual sense, not a physical sense.
Right. And we should all want some of that.
Yeah, we should.
For ourselves. It's occasionally, you'll hear people when Paul goes back on the road, why is he still doing that? And my answer is always, why wouldn't you? If you could do that and forget the adulation and the fame and the compensation, just if you can still do that and enjoy it the way he does. You mentioned the concerts, but there's always the sound check first, which is even,
yes,
another hour. If I did any of that, I think I'd be out for a week. But maybe it's the adrenaline and the enthusiasm that's driving it. Well, you articulate that so well in your books. What is it then with Taylor that what would be the parallel in the Taylor story where we can understand how she goes about that business?
I've always loved her songwriting for that enthusiasm, for that sort of gung-ho jumping into every emotion. When she's singing about heartbreaks that have some really trivial sort of origins, in the song, she'll just have a really like impulsive heartbreak that seems absolutely cataclysmic. And her ability to summon that is always kind of astounding to me. And that's something that she had in her songwriting from the beginning. It's really wild to like go back and listen to her country debut album from 2006. And she's all there right in that. And she is absolutely so unfettered in her combination of raw emotion, almost frighteningly intense levels of emotion, with that McCartney-esque pop craft that she has. Her knack with choruses and bridges. Her bridges are kind of famous in themselves. And she has albums that are just basically the Lover album and the Speak Now album are two examples of albums where she's like, I'm just going to make bridges so long and twisty and endless that they're basically another song. I'm just going to sing another song in the middle of this one. And for Taylor and Paul, I mean, it's funny to be obsessed with both of them and to have written about both of them just because they are so similar in terms of their personalities in so many ways. Their obsessions, their crotchets, their fanaticism about making pop music. There's something really fascinating about them. I love when Rolling Stone did a Musicians on Musicians story a couple of years ago where Paul was interviewing Taylor, or maybe Taylor was interviewing Paul, but it was astounding to see how much they had in common. They immediately just started talking about numerology because she was like, you had McCartney 1 in 1970 and then McCartney 2 in 1980. And then in 2020, you did McCartney 3. And he's like, well, you're one to talk. I know you're obsessed with the number 13 and just stuff like that they have in common. It's really funny to see.
You mentioned those songs, and of course she still does them, right? Where she may be speaking about a heartbreak that's trivial or small or a momentary lapse that we all experience in our emotional lives, but in the moment it's really important. And I know that's why my students connect with her, is because she gets the immediacy of what life is like, right?
Yes.
Something that may seem small to one person, as you said, can be cataclysmic to another, even though it might pass with the whimsy of youth or what have you. That's a real thing.
It's really intense. And the way she just commits to those vivid emotions, and this isn't something that she abandoned in her adolescence. It isn't something that she outgrew as a songwriter. She is always very emotionally tumultuous, emotionally turbulent, and very loud, and manages to communicate the immediacy and intensity of those emotions in every song. It's really wild to hear a song like Opalite, which I heard in the radio last night, and hearing it, out of the context of the album, just in a mix of pop music, it just jumps out, like how she has this sort of 60s girl group, Ronettes, Crystal, Shangri-La's kind of theme in the music, and writes a very Phil Spector-y sort of chorus. And yet it's got this really strange and eccentric sort of story and eccentric sort of diction as she's telling the story as it goes along. I mean, I had no idea until this song came out what opalite was. I never heard of it. It's artificial onyx. It's fake. It's human made. And her point is like that can be as sparkling as actual onyx. And that kind of level of geology. It's funny. I have a friend who's a geologist out in the West Coast, and she said this is a really good week to be a geologist and a Swiftie. She's suddenly like knowing all about opalite is a real advantage at this point.
Occasionally, those two worlds do come together, right?
Yes. And Belle had to explain to me what opalite is. I had no idea. But for Taylor and her ability to take what could be an ordinary moment and just transmogrify it into something glorious and luminous and messy and turbulent, that's, to me, that's pop songwriting at its best. And that's also something she has in common with Paul McCartney, a song that I loved as a little boy, and then sort of it faded away from me as an adult, and that I've just gotten totally re-obsessed with in middle age is Penny Lane. And how just what an astoundingly ordinary sort of scene he's watching. And of course, when you're a little kid and a little American kid, you listen, it sounds so exotic, like the portrait of the Queen, all these details that are very quotidian. And of course, as you find out as time goes on that Penny Lane was very important in the John and Paul friendship, because that was where he took the bus. And for Paul to just be imagining this really quotidian scene where almost literally nothing happens. It rains on Penny Lane. That's the only thing. But he's standing there and he's just watching these people and observing with so much wonder and enthusiasm that he makes it a scene. He makes it memorable. And to me, that kind of songwriting is just really rare. And the ones who do it at its best are my favorite songwriters. Yeah, and Taylor and the Beatles have something else in common too, and that is they may seem deceptively simple, right? But they're not. A song like Penny Lane is actually quite a complexity, certainly on the musical side and the recording technology side. But even then, you've got this wonderful line, and every time I teach it, we come back to this, and that is, the pretty nurse, who feels as if she's in a play. Yes.
Anyway.
Yes.
It's a meta moment, right? It's a moment indeed where, both things are true. She's in everybody else's play, we're in each other's plays, in that kind of existential sense. It's a really smart song.
It is. Well, and that character, the pretty nurse, is so fascinating to me that, she's the only character in the song where Paul is wondering about their thoughts, their interior life. He isn't, I guess the fireman's proud of his clean machine, but for him to be just seeing the nurse selling poppies from a tray and imagining how she thinks about this scene, what it's like from her point of view, it's a very McCartney-esque songwriting move. And it's really funny that he is forever interested in these female characters and their interior lives, whether it's, Another Day in 1971 or Jenny Wren in 2004, which is another one of my faves. But he is someone who he's a songwriter who just has that sort of telepathy crossed with empathy right away.
And the Beatles, of course, are early adopters. They've got a number of songs about female agency: Ticket to Ride, Drive My Car, Norwegian Wood. It's pretty amazing, really. It's one of the many things for which they're way ahead of the curve.
Absolutely. And that's part of Rubber's soul. And it's the storytelling on Rubber's Soul is just really wild in terms of these charismatic women who populate that album and speak in languages that Paul doesn't speak and John doesn't speak. And they ask philosophical questions. And, they sit on the rug talking about philosophy until 2 a.m. And she has a job. The women on this album have careers and aspirations and ambitions.
Or egos like the girl in Girl.
Absolutely. I love how the first line of the album is "Asked a girl what she wanted to be." Now, I am old enough to remember when in the 70s hearing this song, that was a question that little boys were asked, not little girls. And even then, I remember just being like kind of amazed and impressed by that opening line, the opening line of the album. And as Paul has the wonderful story in his book Many Years From Now, writing the song, and when he and John were first trying to write Drive My Car, it was really boring. Paul said, you could always tell when we were in a rut in terms of writing because we would rhyme things with rings. And he said, that's always the giveaway, that we had nothing that day. And that then they figured out this LA woman as they imagined her. And as Paul says, suddenly there was a girl, the heroine of the story, and the song just came from her.
It's just amazing. And we are, of course, the beneficiaries of this so many decades on. I just had some high school students from Washington State Zoom in with me, and they said, "What's your favorite thing about the Beatles?" And I said that, well, there's so many, but one of the things is that it makes everything else outside of our loved ones, for example, or our memories, seem kind of superfluous. Well, in the sense that, when you're having a rough day at work, I remember some times and some years back where there was a lot of stress. And I remember literally as I'm driving to work, thinking about my stress, the Beatles are on, probably my CD player in my car. And I'm thinking, you know what? This is going to be a hellacious day at work, but at least I've got the Beatles. And I wouldn't trade that for anything, right?
Absolutely. Well, and they follow you through your life, because everybody hears the Beatles as a little kid, and then you keep hearing the Beatles as the decades go by, and that your relationship to these songs change. I listen to Girl now, which is such an intense song, and I think, what did I think this song was about when I was 8? Because
it's really an adult song.
It's a very adult song. And
Yeah.
I could tell as a little kid hearing the Beatles for the first time when they were telling adult stories, when they were not watering it down for me. Ticket to Ride, which you mentioned, where, he's like, yeah, she said that living with me was bringing her down, which is a kind of heavy line on a lot of levels for the time I heard it. But I remember hearing that It was when I was seeing the movie Help as a little kid, which is when I was hearing the Beatles for the first time. So at that point, you know, the Ticket to Ride scene, I was maybe only 20 minutes into my life as a Beatles fan, but I thought like, wow, this is a really grown up song. This is not one they're aiming at me. There are other songs on that movie and that period where they're aiming it at me. Like, you know, You're Gonna Lose That Girl, which is a very comprehensible, although amazing and fascinating and multi-layered sort of romance. But for Ticket to Ride, which is a really jaded adult song, and of course I had no way of knowing then, a real Dylan-y kind of song that, into the chorus, that was, I could tell they were not speaking directly to me. Those were adults singing together and speaking to each other.
Right, and the woman in it, you know, she's got a ticket to ride, and she don't care. You know, we were, and young women are acculturated into being caring people, right, by society. What did that mean? I remember having that same kind of experience where I was like, but women care. Why would she stop caring? Oh my God. It felt like a crisis. And in a way it was for the guy. Absolutely.
And that he doesn't know, and that he does not know, like, why she's leaving. He does not know why living with him was getting her down. She's not giving him an explanation, and he doesn't have one. And it's one of those songs where, you know, where the Beatles are singing about a character who is beyond them, which is something that they were so consistently great at in their storytelling.
Yeah, like For No One, right? I mean, that guy is missing what's happening on a lot of levels.
Yes, and you know, there'll be times when the thing she said will fill your head, you won't forget her. And it's like, wow, Paul, that's the ending to this song? Like, maybe you could give us maybe a little happier ending. He was not at all tempted to give that song a happy ending. And just that it ends without even a reason for her leaving, you know? Someone's gone. She doesn't need him. That's just it. His name comes up at dinner and she's like, oh yes, you know, I knew him. Yes. It's like the Dylan song, When We Meet Again, introduced his friends. But for No One, which is such an intense song, and that Paul just says at the end, and for me, listening to that song as a little boy, that was not what I wanted to hear, that he said, yeah, when she's gone, the thing she said will fill your head. You won't forget her. And that was a heavy sentiment to tell me about, but Paul was not wrong about that.
No, he was very right. That, you know, when you're living, you certainly gather a lot of scars, and he's never been afraid to show his.
Absolutely.
So we're in this moment with the new release of the makeover for Anthology and the whole Anthology project. And it seems like to me it's a good time, a good occasion to think about, you know, where this enterprise goes next, right? It feels kind of like the end of something. This not the end of the Beatles, naturally. That is impossible. As long as we have ears, we'll be listening to the Beatles. But it feels like we're entering a kind of new space with how we think longitudinally about this band.
Well, in a sense, we always are. And there have been so many moments where it seemed like the end. Certainly 30 years ago when Anthology came out, people saw it as tying a bow on the story. Everybody thought that this, what?
A capstone, yeah.
Yes, a capstone. Certainly people were shocked at how much they loved Anthology. People in the early 90s were expecting to love Anthology, but they were shocked by how much they did love it. That was something that was part of that experience with it being on TV. Even for people who missed it on TV, the numbers that those CDs sold in the 90s, and of course, people bought a lot of CDs in the 90s, but the fact that all three of the Anthology volumes were such mega sellers, and just the overall enthusiasm for Anthology just completely shocked the world. They definitely shocked people in the music world. And everybody figured, wow, well, okay, that's the big ending. This is the end of the story. They can't they can't dig into their vaults any deeper. Little did we know how much great stuff was still sitting in the vaults. But, then a few years after that, they put out One, which is the most generic, predictable, easy, assemble in your sleep Beatles hits collection there could possibly be. And that becomes a blockbuster seller. And again, people think, okay, we predicted the end of the Beatles. We were wrong. Every time it seems like it's leveled out, like it's reached the plateau, the kids grab it and run with it. I hate to put it that way, but just people keep hearing the Beatles, discovering the Beatles, and taking it in crazy new directions. And that to me is just something kind of phenomenal. There's never been any need to turn people on to the Beatles because they do a better job of finding people than any music ever has. Yeah,
well, I mean, it's your gateway song, if I remember, was Help. And once it's arresting. You hear it and you think, I've been listening to Top 40 radio. It's not like this.
Yeah. Well, and hearing that song as a little kid, seeing the movie Help for the first time, it was really moving. The song was really moving right away. And I could tell that it was really different the way that they were telling the story together, which is something that is absolutely going on Rubber Soul. Rubber Soul, those songs are not solo songs. People don't cover the songs from Rubber Soul, and when they try, they fail because they're not songs for solo voices. They're all songs designed for the Beatles to sing and tell the story together. Even a really personal song like Norwegian Wood, you listen to it and you just pay attention to the harmonies, and there's no song at all without those harmonies. That's the way with all those songs on Rubber Soul. Even Michelle, which seems really simple, there wouldn't be a song at all without that fantastic, droll, John and George backup vocal as, where they add a bit of doo-wop behind it. It's really kind of astounding how Rubber Soul is an album that's meant to be sung together. And certainly Help is a song that's meant to be sung together. And it's really beautiful how John is confessing these doubts and insecurities, and he has his friends nudging him along. He's like, well, when I was young, and he's like, okay, I never needed anyone's help in any way. And that he needs them for their support to tell the story. And that's really kind of remarkable. The fact that Paul is singing Help on this current tour that he's doing, and that he's beginning the show with it, as if he doesn't already have enough very candid, very revealing John moments in the set. It's like he's in his 80s and he's going back to this song that his best friend wrote when he was 24. And this is a song that he wrote, and he must have known that there was a lot going on in that song at that time. But what it means to Paul now, so many years after losing John, and still agonizing over this friendship that for him is broken and unfixable and has things about it that need to be addressed, that this is still such a raw wound for him. And it was just indescribably emotional to hear Paul sing Help and go all the way into this story that he once had a role in this song of helping John tell this story. And now he's up there telling the story himself, singing the John part. It's intensely moving.
I felt similarly when he had a day in the life in his set a few years back.
Oh my gosh. Okay, there was this show in New York, and A Day in the Life hadn't been in the set list. But he said, I was in New York today. I was thinking about John. I want to do this one for John. And he did A Day in the Life. It seemed really impulsive. And of course, it breaks into him singing Give Peace a Chance. But it was a thing where, nobody, even people who were studying the set lists before coming to the show, they didn't see that twist coming. And it just seemed so tossed off, but so heartfelt. And there's just so much of that in Paul's show. It's amazing to me that he tells different versions of how he wrote Here Today every night. That Paul has a lot of standard patter. He's got jokes that he told for years, almost verbatim, but he's had Here Today in his set for nearly 25 years. And he can't settle on what to introduce it with. He's always sort of making it up as he goes along. He emphasizes different parts of the story. Here Today gets a different intro every night. And this is a song that's so emotional. You would think that it would be really helpful to him to have a script to go into this really raw and vulnerable song. And yet he cannot settle on any degree of composure to bring to that song. And to me, it's so moving that not only is he still singing this song to John every night, but he's still explaining it to the audience as if he is just figuring this out for the first time.
Everything Fab Four is presented by Salon.com, the premier news, politics, innovation, and arts website. For more information, visit everythingfab4.com, where you can learn more about our podcast and my latest Beatles-related book, Living the Beatles Legend, The Untold Story of Mal Evans. The Everything Fab Four theme song, Seize the Day, is provided courtesy of Black Rabbit, the high-octane Beatles cover band, an innovative psychedelic rock project from Rockaway Beach, Queens in New York City. Like what you heard today on Everything Fab Four? Be sure to subscribe, give us a rating, and recommend the show to your friends. Plus, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at EF4 Podcast. Distributed by Salon.com, Everything Fab Four is a Wonderwall production. Remember, it's a Beatles world, and everyone has a story.